Sherlock Holmes had solved hundreds of mysteries in his remarkable career. He had faced murderers, criminal masterminds, and men who believed themselves far too powerful to ever be caught. Yet, on one quiet winter evening at Baker Street, the danger that arrived at his door was not a killer. It was his past. A single letter, and before that night was over, two influential men in London would be dead. A buried conspiracy would begin to surface, and the reputation of Sherlock Holmes himself would stand dangerously close to ruin. At the time, of course, neither Holmes nor I could have guessed how deeply that letter would disturb the quiet routine of Baker Street. The envelope arrived so quietly that at first it seemed no different from the rest of the evening's post. But the few words written inside that envelope were enough to reopen a matter that should have remained buried forever. There are certain evenings in London when the city feels strangely aware of itself. Not louder, not darker, just watchful. That particular winter evening was one of them. A thin mist had begun to drift through the streets, softening the glow of the gas lamps and wrapping Baker Street in a pale, silvery haze. From the window of our sitting room at 221B, I could see the faint outlines of passing cabs and pedestrians moving like distant shadows through the fog. Inside, however, the fire burned warmly in the grate, casting a comfortable orange glow across the room. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have been one of those peaceful evenings Holmes and I had spent together many times before. But that night, something felt different, and the reason for it stood only a few steps from the fireplace. Sherlock Holmes, my friend, was standing beside the mantelpiece, his tall, thin figure wrapped in the old purple dressing gown he favored whenever he was deep in thought. His hands were clasped behind his back, and the firelight caught the sharp outline of his profile. At first glance, he appeared perfectly calm. But I had known Holmes long enough to recognize the subtle signs that betrayed his state of mind. The slight tension in his shoulders, the stillness that seemed almost forced, and above all, the silence. Holmes was rarely silent without reason. The uneasy silence that followed Holmes's final word lingered in the room like a thin thread drawn too tightly. I had intended to question him further. Indeed, the strange mood that had overtaken my friend that evening demanded explanation. Yet Holmes had already withdrawn into that peculiar mental solitude which I had come to recognize as the prelude to intense reflection. He stood by the window once more, gazing into the fog that had thickened outside Baker Street. The fire behind him cast his long shadow across the carpet, and for a time neither of us spoke. Then a sound broke the stillness. Footsteps on the stair. A moment later there came the familiar knock at the sitting-room door. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying the Evening Post upon a small silver tray. "Your letters, Mr. Holmes," she said kindly. "The last delivery of the day." Holmes turned with mild impatience. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson." She placed the tray upon the table and withdrew, closing the door quietly behind her. There were perhaps half a dozen envelopes in the small pile, ordinary correspondence of the sort Holmes received daily from clients, police officials, and occasionally the more eccentric corners of London society. Holmes glanced over them with only casual interest. One envelope, however, caused him to stop. He picked it up slowly. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he turned the envelope over in his hand, studying it with sudden intensity. Even from where I sat, I could see that the letter differed from the others. The paper was thick and expensive, yet there was no crest, no address of a sender, no indication of origin beyond the carefully written line across the front. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street." The handwriting was precise, firm, and strangely deliberate. Holmes held the envelope closer to the lamp. "Curious," he murmured. "In what way?" I asked. "This letter should not exist." I rose from my chair and crossed the room. "Surely it is merely another client seeking your assistance." Holmes shook his head. "No." He tapped the envelope lightly with one long finger. "The paper is continental in manufacture, French, if I'm not mistaken. The ink, however, is English and recently purchased. The hand that wrote this address is controlled, disciplined, almost military in character." "Then the writer is a soldier?" "Possibly," Holmes replied. "But that is not what troubles me." He broke the seal. A single sheet of paper slid from the envelope. Holmes unfolded it. As his eyes moved across the brief message, something remarkable happened. Sherlock Holmes, whose composure I had seen withstand assassins, blackmailers, and some of the most dangerous criminals in Europe, became very still. "Holmes?" I said quietly. He did not answer. Instead, he handed the letter to me. "Read it." The message was short, disturbingly short. "Mr. Holmes, 20 years ago you made a decision that allowed the truth to remain buried. You believed the matter finished. It was not. I have returned to London, and the game you abandoned will now begin again. The first payment of that old debt has already been made. Ask yourself, Mr. Holmes, how long can your reputation survive the truth? There was no signature, only a small symbol at the bottom of the page, a single initial. H.I. looked up sharply. What does this mean? Holmes had turned away from me again. He stood beside the mantelpiece, his gaze fixed on the fire as though the flames themselves contained the answer. "Holmes," I pressed, "this letter accuses you of concealing the truth. It suggests that someone has returned to reopen an old affair." "Yes. Then surely you must explain." Holmes remained silent for several seconds. At last he spoke. "There are many cases in my career, Watson," he said slowly. "Some of them difficult, some dangerous, a few regrettable." He turned back toward me. "But there is only one case I would describe as unfinished." I held up the letter. "The writer refers to something that happened 20 years ago." Holmes nodded. "That is correct." "And the initial?" "H." Holmes's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Yes. Do you know who sent it?" "I believe I do." The calmness of his tone disturbed me more than any alarm might have done. "Then who is he?" Holmes crossed the room and took the letter from my hand. For a moment he studied the symbol again. "It is not the letter itself that troubles me," he said quietly. "It is the implication behind it." "What implication?" Holmes folded the paper once more. "If the man who wrote this letter truly has returned to London," he said, "then somewhere in this city tonight a crime has already been committed." The words chilled me. "A crime?" Holmes placed the letter upon the table beside the other scattered papers. "Yes, Watson." He looked toward the window where the fog pressed thickly against the glass. "The letter states that the first payment of an old debt has already been made." His voice had grown very quiet. "And if I am correct," he paused, "then the secret I believed buried 20 years ago has just claimed its first victim." For several moments after Holmes spoke, neither of us moved. The fire crackled quietly in the grate, and somewhere outside a carriage rolled slowly along Baker Street, its wheels muffled by the damp fog that hung in the air. Yet within our sitting room, the atmosphere had grown strangely heavy, as though the letter upon the table had altered the very balance of the room. I looked again at the folded sheet of paper. "Holmes," I said at last, "if what you suspect is true, then a crime has already taken place." Holmes gave a slight nod. "And if that crime is connected with the man who wrote this letter," I continued, "then surely it demands investigation." Holmes did not immediately reply. Instead, he moved slowly to the table, gathered the scattered papers, and placed them into a neat stack with deliberate care. The action seemed curiously methodical, almost as though he were closing a matter rather than preparing to pursue it. Then he spoke. "No, Watson," he said quietly. "It does not." I stared at him. "Does not." "This matter," Holmes continued, "is not a case for investigation. But the letter—" "The letter," Holmes interrupted gently, "is precisely the reason why it must not be investigated." His tone was calm, yet there was an unmistakable firmness in it which I had seldom heard before. "Holmes," I said slowly, "a man may already have been murdered. That is possible. And you intend to do nothing?" Holmes met my gaze. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer stunned me. In all the years I had known Sherlock Holmes, I had never once seen him refuse a mystery, particularly one that presented such obvious intrigue. The challenge alone would normally have drawn him into action with irresistible force. Yet now he appeared determined to withdraw from the matter entirely. "That is unlike you," I said quietly. Holmes turned away and walked toward the window once more. "Perhaps," he replied, I rose from my chair and followed him. "You cannot expect me to believe that this letter means nothing to you," I said. "Your reaction alone proves the opposite." Holmes stood with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing into the fog-shrouded street. "It means a great deal to me," he said at last. Then why refuse to investigate? For several seconds he did not answer. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a thoughtful tone that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "Because," he said slowly, "some questions once answered cannot easily be forgotten." "That has never stopped you before?" "No." Holmes turned slightly toward the firelight. "But there is a difference between solving a mystery, Watson, and reopening a past that has been deliberately closed." I considered his words carefully. "You said earlier that there was one case in your career you regarded as unfinished." Holmes nodded. "Yes." "And this letter concerns that case?" "Yes." "Then surely that is reason enough to pursue it." Holmes's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "No," he said quietly. "It is the reason I must not." I studied him in silence. "You believe that investigating this matter will expose something," I said. Holmes did not deny it. "Something about you." Still, he said nothing. "Holmes," I continued carefully, "I have known you long enough to understand that you are not a man easily troubled by reputation." "That is true." "Then what is it you fear?" Holmes looked at me. For a brief instant, the mask of calm intelligence I knew so well seemed to slip. What replaced it was not fear exactly, but something close to regret. "There are moments in a man's early career," Holmes said quietly, "when circumstances force him to make a choice without fully understanding the consequences. A mistake?" Holmes shook his head. "No, something worse." The answer sent an unexpected chill through me. "What could be worse than a mistake?" I asked. Holmes walked slowly back to the table. "A compromise." He picked up the letter again. "20 years ago," he continued, "I was not the man you know today. My reputation had not yet been established. My independence had not yet been earned. And someone used that against you." Holmes gave the faintest nod. "Yes." "Who?" Holmes folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the envelope. "A man whose name should have remained buried in the past. And yet he has returned." "So it appears." I crossed my arms thoughtfully. "If this individual truly has resumed whatever conflict existed between you," I said, "then ignoring him will not make the matter disappear." Holmes looked at me with a faint, weary smile. "No, Watson," he said, "it will not. Then why refuse the case?" Holmes walked to the mantelpiece and placed the envelope beside the scattered documents. "Because the man who wrote this letter does not seek justice," he said quietly. "What does he seek?" Holmes's eyes moved toward the window once more. "Revelation?" The word lingered in the air. "And if he succeeds," Holmes continued, "the secret he intends to reveal may destroy something that has taken me many years to build." "You mean your reputation?" Holmes nodded. "Yes." For several moments neither of us spoke. At last I broke the silence. "Holmes," I said firmly, "if the truth of some past affair threatens you now, then surely it is better to confront it openly than to allow another man to control it." Holmes regarded me thoughtfully. "That," he said, "is the very argument I would have made myself only yesterday. And now? Now I suspect that confronting this matter may lead to consequences far worse than silence." I stepped closer to the table and looked again at the envelope. "Nevertheless," I said, "if the man behind this letter has already committed murder, the matter has passed beyond your personal concerns." Holmes said nothing. Outside, the fog pressed thickly against the windows of Baker Street. For a moment, the city seemed unnaturally still. Then Holmes spoke again. "Very well, Watson." His voice was calm once more, though I sensed a decision had been made. "We shall do nothing." I opened my mouth to protest, but Holmes raised one hand gently. "For tonight," he said. He looked again at the letter. "Tomorrow," he added quietly, "London will tell us whether the past truly intends to remain buried." And though I could not yet understand the full meaning of his words, I felt an uneasy certainty that the mysterious letter lying upon the table had already set events in motion which neither of us could prevent. Morning in London arrived slowly, as it often does in the colder months, with a pale grey light that filtered through the fog, rather than dispelling it. When I awoke the next day, the city seemed subdued, as though the uneasy atmosphere of the previous evening had lingered into daylight. Holmes, however, had been awake long before me. When I entered our sitting room at Baker Street, I found him seated in his armchair beside the window, his long figure bent slightly forward and his sharp eyes fixed upon the morning newspapers spread across the table. He did not look up immediately. Instead, he tapped one finger thoughtfully against the edge of the paper, as though considering some private calculation. "Good morning, Holmes," I said. "Good morning, Watson." His tone was calm, almost excessively calm. That alone caused me a certain unease. "Have you slept at all?" I asked. "Very little." I suspected as much. I poured myself a cup of tea and took the chair opposite him. "Have you reconsidered the matter of the letter?" I asked. Holmes folded the newspaper carefully and placed it beside the others. "No. And yet I see you studying the morning reports." "A habit of mine," he replied lightly. "Even the most routine news may occasionally reveal something useful." Before I could reply, a sudden noise echoed up the stairway. It was not the quiet step of Mrs. Hudson this time. It was rapid, heavy, urgent. Holmes looked up sharply. A moment later the door burst open and Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard entered the room. The inspector was breathing hard, as though he had hurried up the stairs 2 at a time. His usually composed expression showed unmistakable agitation. "Holmes," he said. Holmes rose calmly. "Inspector Gregson, this is an early visit." "Early, perhaps," Gregson replied, removing his hat. "But necessary." He glanced briefly toward me. "Dr. Watson, Inspector." Gregson ran a hand across his brow. "I regret disturbing you at such an hour, Holmes, but we have a matter of some urgency." Holmes gestured toward a chair. "Please sit down and tell us what has happened." Gregson remained standing. "A murder," he said. Holmes did not move. "Murder is rarely a surprise in London, Inspector. This one should interest you." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "In what way?" Gregson reached into his coat and withdrew a small notebook. "The victim is a retired military officer," he said, "Major Arthur Pemberton." Holmes's expression did not change, though I noticed a subtle tightening in his posture. "Where was the body discovered?" he asked. "In his residence in Belgrave Square. And the circumstances?" Gregson hesitated. "That is the difficulty." Holmes folded his arms. "Explain." Gregson cleared his throat. "The Major was found this morning in his study. He was seated at his desk exactly as though he had been writing a letter. Cause of death. That is precisely what we cannot determine." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Gregson looked from Holmes to me. "There are no wounds," he said. "No signs of violence, no poison that our physician could immediately identify." Holmes said nothing. "The room was locked from the inside." Gregson continued. "The windows secured. There is no sign of forced entry." "A locked room death," Holmes said quietly. Gregson nodded. "Yes." Holmes walked slowly toward the window. Outside, Baker Street remained wrapped in its usual morning haze. "Curious," he murmured. Gregson shifted uncomfortably. "There is more." Holmes turned. "I expected as much." Gregson reached again into his coat and removed a folded sheet of paper. "This was found on the desk beside the body." Holmes held out his hand. Gregson gave him the paper. Holmes unfolded it. The moment his eyes fell upon the message, I saw the change. Not shock. Holmes was too controlled a man for that. But the same stillness I had observed the previous evening returned instantly. "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he handed the paper to me. The message had been written in bold, deliberate handwriting. Only one sentence appeared upon the page: "The first payment of the old debt." Beneath the words was the same symbol I had seen in the mysterious letter the previous evening, the letter H. I looked up quickly. Holmes was already watching Gregson. "You found this beside the victim?" he asked. "Yes. And you are certain no one entered the room?" "As certain as we can be." Holmes's gaze moved briefly toward the envelope still lying upon the table, the envelope from the previous night. For several seconds he said nothing. Then Gregson spoke again. "There is something else," he said. Holmes looked at him. "What?" The Major had a visitor last night. Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. A visitor? Yes. Did the servant see him? No. Then how do you know he was there? Gregson hesitated. Because, he said slowly, the butler heard the Major speaking with someone in the study shortly before midnight. Holmes's expression hardened, and the visitor left no trace. None. I glanced again at the paper in my hand. The first payment of the old debt. Holmes turned away and stared out the window once more. The fog over London seemed heavier now. At length he spoke quietly. Inspector Gregson? Yes. Holmes's voice was calm again, though the tension had returned to his posture. You asked yesterday why this case should interest me. That is correct. Holmes looked at the message once more. This murder, he said slowly, is not merely a crime. Gregson frowned. What do you mean? Holmes folded the paper carefully. It is a warning. He placed the message beside the envelope on the table. And the man who sent it, Holmes added quietly, has just begun to collect a debt that should never have existed. Within half an hour, Holmes and I were seated in a hansom cab, bound for Belgrave Square. The fog that had lingered over London since the previous evening had thickened rather than lifted, wrapping the city in a damp grey curtain through which the outlines of houses and lamp-posts appeared only faintly visible. Inspector Gregson sat opposite us, his notebook already open as the cab rattled through the narrow streets. The body was discovered shortly after 8 this morning, he said. The Major's butler entered the study to deliver breakfast and found the door locked. Locked from the inside? Holmes asked. Yes. And the windows? Also secured. Holmes leaned back slightly. Then the butler forced the door. He used the spare key. Holmes nodded faintly. Very good. Continue. The Major was seated at his desk, Gregson said. Dead, and the paper bearing the message lay beside him. Yes. Holmes remained silent for the rest of the journey. When we arrived at Belgrave Square, the cab stopped before a tall, dignified townhouse that stood in quiet contrast to the agitation its interior had evidently witnessed. 2 constables guarded the entrance. Gregson led us inside. The house was silent. A thin-faced butler greeted us in the hallway, his expression pale and strained. This way, gentlemen, he said quietly. He led us up a wide staircase and along a corridor toward a heavy wooden door. That is the study, Gregson said. Holmes paused before entering. Has anyone disturbed the room since the discovery? He asked. No, Gregson replied. I instructed my men to leave everything exactly as it was. Holmes nodded. Excellent. He pushed the door open. The study was a comfortable room lined with bookshelves and lit by 2 tall windows overlooking the square. A large writing desk stood near the center, and in the chair behind it sat the body of Major Arthur Pemberton. The Major appeared almost peaceful. His hands rested upon the arms of the chair, and his head had fallen slightly to one side, as though he had merely dozed off while writing. Holmes stepped forward quietly. For several seconds he examined the body without speaking. Curious, he murmured. Gregson shifted uneasily. You see the difficulty. Holmes bent slightly and studied the Major's face. No marks, he said. None. Holmes examined the man's hands, then his collar, then the edge of the desk. No sign of struggle. None. Holmes straightened and began slowly walking around the room. Watson, I had learned long ago that when Holmes moved in this manner, silently, methodically, his mind was assembling the fragments of a puzzle. The desk, he said quietly. Gregson pointed. That is where the paper was found. Holmes examined the surface carefully. A pen and inkwell stood neatly arranged beside a half-written letter. Holmes read the unfinished lines aloud. My dear Colonel, he stopped. Interesting. Gregson frowned. What is it? Holmes gestured to the page. The Major was writing to someone. That is obvious. Yes. Holmes's eyes narrowed, but the sentence stops abruptly. He looked again at the body, as though the writer had been interrupted. Gregson rubbed his chin. Yet no one entered the room. Holmes moved toward the windows. Both were firmly latched. He examined the floor, then the carpet, then the shelves. After several minutes, he returned to the desk. "Inspector," he said calmly, "you mentioned that the butler heard the Major speaking with someone last night." "Yes. At what hour?" "Shortly before midnight." Holmes tapped the desk lightly. "And the Major was alive then?" "Yes." Holmes considered this for a moment. "Did the butler hear the visitor leave?" "No." "Did he hear the door open?" "No." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then our visitor must possess a remarkable talent for disappearing." Gregson sighed. "That is precisely the difficulty." Holmes bent closer to the desk again. "The message," he said. "Where exactly was it found?" "Here," Gregson indicated the spot. Holmes placed his fingertips lightly on the wood. Then he did something unexpected. He lifted the chair in which the Major sat and examined the floor beneath it. "What are you looking for?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the carpet. "Observe this, Watson." I stepped closer. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then Holmes adjusted the angle of the chair slightly. A faint impression appeared in the carpet. "Another chair stood here," Holmes said. Gregson leaned forward. "You are certain?" "Yes." "For how long?" Holmes studied the mark. "Long enough to suggest a conversation." Gregson looked puzzled. "But there is no second chair in the room." Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely." He walked slowly to the window again. "This room," he said quietly, "contained 2 men last night." Gregson crossed his arms. "But only one body remains." Holmes nodded. "Yes." He turned back toward the desk. "And the second man," he added calmly, "left the room without opening either the door or the windows." Gregson stared at him. "That is impossible." Holmes's expression remained thoughtful. "No, Inspector." He looked again at the faint mark in the carpet. "It is merely improbable." He stepped toward the wall beside the bookshelf. His fingers brushed lightly against the wooden paneling. "Every locked room mystery," Holmes said quietly, "depends upon one simple illusion." Gregson frowned. "What illusion?" Holmes pressed gently against the wall. "That the room is truly locked." The panel shifted slightly beneath his hand. Gregson's eyes widened. Holmes turned toward us with a calm expression. "And when that illusion fails," he said quietly, "the entire mystery begins to unravel." For several seconds after Holmes pressed against the wooden panel, no one in the room moved. The slight shift in the wall had been almost imperceptible, yet its meaning was unmistakable. Inspector Gregson stepped forward quickly. "A hidden door?" Holmes withdrew his hand from the panel and examined the narrow seam that had appeared between the boards. "Not a door precisely," he said. "More accurately, a concealed passage." Gregson stared at the wall. "But this house was inspected thoroughly when the police arrived. No such passage was reported." Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "That is because whoever designed it intended precisely that result." He ran his fingers slowly along the wooden surface until they reached a small brass stud disguised within the carving of the panel. With a gentle push, the section of wall moved inward. A narrow opening appeared. Beyond it lay a dark corridor scarcely wide enough for a man to pass. Gregson let out a low whistle. "Well," he muttered, "that explains how our visitor left the room." Holmes shook his head slightly. "No, Inspector." Gregson blinked. "No, this passage explains how our visitor entered." He glanced again at the body of Major Pemberton seated at the desk. "But the departure may prove more complicated." Gregson frowned. "I fail to see the distinction." Holmes stepped into the narrow opening and examined the floor of the passage. Dust covered the boards. After a moment he knelt and studied a faint disturbance in the powdery layer. "Boot marks," he said quietly. "Recent? Very?" Gregson leaned closer. "Only one set." Holmes considered the marks carefully. "Yes?" Then the killer entered through the passage. Holmes rose slowly. That would appear to be the obvious conclusion. Gregson folded his arms. "And yet you sound unconvinced." Holmes turned toward him. "Because obvious conclusions in cases such as this often prove misleading." He stepped back into the study and closed the hidden panel again. The wall returned seamlessly to its former position. Gregson shook his head. "I suppose the house must have been constructed with these passages in the old days." Smugglers, perhaps. Holmes gave a faint shrug, or servants moving unseen through the household. He walked slowly back toward the desk where the Major's body remained seated. "The question is not how the visitor entered the room," Holmes continued thoughtfully. "The question is why he wished to remain unseen." Gregson tapped his notebook. "Because he intended to kill the Major." Holmes glanced at him. "That may be so." He lifted the message that had been found on the desk and studied the bold handwriting again. "The first payment of the old debt." Gregson nodded grimly. "A revenge killing, possibly." Holmes turned the paper over in his hands, but the message suggests something more deliberate. "How so?" Holmes placed the note carefully upon the desk. "Because the writer wishes us to understand that this murder is not an isolated act." Gregson looked uneasy. "You believe there will be more?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward me. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you recall the letter that arrived yesterday evening?" "I remember it perfectly. And the symbol at the bottom? The initial H." Holmes nodded slowly. "This message bears the same mark." Gregson looked from one of us to the other. "Are you suggesting that the two letters are connected?" Holmes's expression had grown serious again. "They are not merely connected." He placed both hands lightly upon the desk. "They were written by the same man." Gregson's brows rose. "And you know who he is?" Holmes hesitated. For the first time since we had entered the house, the calm certainty in his manner seemed to falter. "Yes," he said at last. "Then who is he?" Gregson demanded. Holmes walked slowly toward the window and looked out at the grey square beyond. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the quiet outlines of the neighboring houses. 20 years ago, Holmes said quietly, "I investigated a matter involving several men of considerable influence." Gregson frowned. "A criminal conspiracy?" "Yes." "And Major Pemberton was involved?" Holmes nodded. "He was one of the individuals whose actions drew my attention." Gregson opened his notebook again. "Then the murder may be revenge for something that happened during that investigation." Holmes turned toward him. "That is my belief." Gregson tapped his pencil impatiently. "Then surely you can name the man responsible." Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he walked slowly back toward the desk and looked once more at the message lying beside the dead Major. "The difficulty, Inspector," he said quietly, "is that the man who wrote this message should not be alive." Gregson stared at him. "You mean you believed him dead?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Nearly 20 years." Gregson let out a short breath. "Well," he said grimly, "London has a remarkable habit of producing ghosts." Holmes gave a faint, humorless smile. "Yes." He folded the message once more. "And this particular ghost," he added quietly, "was one of the most dangerous men I ever pursued." Gregson leaned forward eagerly. "Then tell us his name." Holmes's eyes moved slowly across the room, as though the past itself were standing somewhere in the shadows of the study. At last he spoke. "Colonel Adrian Havelock." The name seemed to settle heavily in the room. Gregson wrote it quickly in his notebook. "And who exactly is Colonel Havelock?" Holmes looked again at the body of Major Pemberton. "A man," he said quietly, "whose life was destroyed by the very conspiracy Major Pemberton helped to conceal." Gregson frowned. "Then, this is revenge, yes. But if Havelock believed Pemberton responsible for that conspiracy, why wait 20 years? Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "Because," he said softly, "20 years ago I prevented him from taking that revenge." Gregson's eyes widened. "You stopped him?" "Yes. And now he has returned to finish what he began." Holmes nodded. "Precisely." Gregson closed his notebook. "Well, Holmes," he said, "if this Colonel Havelock has come back to London killing men connected to an old conspiracy, we must find him before he strikes again." Holmes looked once more at the message on the desk. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. "I fear," he said, "that may already be too late." Gregson stiffened. "Why?" Holmes pointed gently at the words written across the paper. "The first payment of the old debt." He folded the message carefully. "And debts," Holmes added slowly, "are seldom paid in single installments." The journey back to Baker Street that afternoon passed in an uneasy silence. Inspector Gregson had remained behind in Belgrave Square to organize the official investigation, while Holmes and I returned alone in a hansom cab that moved slowly through the crowded streets of London. The fog had lifted somewhat by midday, but a heavy grey sky still hung above the city, casting a dull light across the endless rows of houses. Holmes had spoken scarcely a word since leaving the Major's residence. He sat opposite me in the cab, his long frame motionless, his eyes half closed as though absorbed in thought. Yet I knew from experience that behind that calm exterior, his mind was working with relentless precision. At length I broke the silence. "You mentioned earlier," I said, "that Colonel Adrian Havelock was involved in a case nearly 20 years ago." Holmes opened his eyes slowly. "Yes, and that you once prevented him from taking revenge against the men responsible for some conspiracy." "That is correct." I leaned forward slightly. "Holmes, I believe the time has come for you to explain that matter fully." For several seconds, Holmes said nothing. Then he gave a quiet sigh. "You are right, Watson," he said at last. "If we are to understand the events unfolding now, you must know what occurred in that earlier affair." The cab rattled over a stretch of uneven stones, and Holmes looked out the window briefly before continuing. "The case was known unofficially as the Worthington affair," he said. "Worthington?" "Yes. Sir Edmund Worthington, a wealthy industrialist and political financier whose influence in certain government circles was considerable. And Major Pemberton was connected to him?" "Very closely." Holmes clasped his hands lightly together. 20 years ago," he continued, "I was still in the early years of my career. My methods had begun attracting attention, yet I had not yet established the independence I later came to value so highly." "And this case involved Worthington?"
"Yes."
Holmes's voice had taken on a distant quality, as though he were examining events that had long remained buried in memory. "A young officer named Adrian Havelock returned from service overseas and accused Worthington and several associates of orchestrating a scheme involving military contracts." "What kind of scheme?" "Fraud," Holmes said bluntly. "Large sums of money diverted through false procurement agreements. Equipment purchased at inflated prices and supplied through companies secretly controlled by the conspirators themselves." I frowned. "A corruption scandal." "Precisely. And Havelock exposed it. He attempted to." Holmes's gaze drifted again toward the window. "But when he brought his accusations forward, they were dismissed." "Dismissed?" "Yes." "Why?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Because the men involved possessed influence in places where such accusations could quietly disappear. And that is when you became involved." Holmes nodded. "Havelock came to me personally. He had gathered documents, witness accounts, and financial records. Enough evidence to prove the entire conspiracy. Then why was the case not brought to trial?" Holmes remained silent for a moment. "When I began investigating," he said at last, "I discovered that the accusations were entirely accurate. Worthington and his associates were guilty." "Yes." "And Major Pemberton?" Holmes's expression hardened slightly. "He was one of the intermediaries responsible for facilitating certain transactions." I considered this carefully. "Then the conspiracy was real." "Very much so. Yet you said the case was never completed." Holmes nodded slowly. "That is correct." "Why?" Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew his cigarette case. Lighting a cigarette, he leaned back slightly and watched the smoke drift upward. "Because," he said quietly, "my investigation attracted attention." "From the conspirators?" "Yes." "And they attempted to stop you?" Holmes gave a faint, humorless laugh. "They attempted something far more effective." "What?" "They appealed to the government." I stared at him. "You mean the authorities intervened?" "Indeed." Holmes exhaled a slow stream of smoke. "One evening I was summoned to a private meeting with several officials whose authority extended well beyond Scotland Yard. And they ordered you to abandon the investigation." Holmes nodded. "They argued that exposing the scandal would damage military procurement programs already under strain. The country was entering a delicate political period. So the truth was suppressed." Yes. And you accepted that decision? Holmes's eyes met mine. I was young, Watson. That is not an answer. Holmes looked away again. No, he admitted quietly. It is not. For several seconds, the cab continued rolling through the streets without interruption. What happened to Colonel Havelock? I asked at last. Holmes's voice grew quieter. When the investigation was halted, the evidence disappeared. Destroyed. Most of it. And Havelock. He refused to accept the decision. Holmes crushed the cigarette carefully in the ashtray. He believed justice had been stolen from him. And perhaps it had, I said. Holmes did not disagree. Havelock confronted the conspirators directly, he continued. He swore that if the law would not punish them, he would do so himself. Revenge. Yes. And you stopped him. Holmes nodded. I located him before he could carry out his threat. What happened then? Holmes's expression grew thoughtful again. I persuaded him that violence would destroy any remaining chance of exposing the truth. And he believed you, for a time. The cab turned onto Baker Street. And then, I asked quietly. Holmes looked toward the familiar buildings outside. Then, he said softly, Colonel Adrian Havelock vanished. And you believed him dead? Yes. Holmes stepped out of the cab and paused on the pavement. Which is why, he added quietly, his return now presents a danger far greater than simple revenge. I looked at him. Why? Holmes's expression had grown grave once more. Because if Havelock intends to finish what he began 20 years ago, he glanced toward the letter still waiting in our rooms above, then the secrets buried in the Worthington affair may soon be revealed to the entire world. The remainder of that afternoon passed in a silence more troubling than any storm. Holmes had resumed his seat by the window in our sitting room at Baker Street, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, while the thin grey light of the fading day stretched across the carpet. From time to time he rose and paced the room, only to return moments later to the same quiet contemplation. I had known Holmes long enough to recognize the signs. He was reconstructing the past, not merely the events of the morning's crime, but the entire chain of circumstances stretching back 20 years to the Worthington affair. At length, I broke the silence. If Colonel Havelock has returned, I said, then Major Pemberton cannot have been his only target. Holmes did not turn from the window. No, he said quietly. You believe others are in danger? Yes. Then surely we must warn them. Holmes gave a faint shake of his head. I fear that would prove difficult. Why? Holmes moved away from the window and returned to the table. Because the list of men involved in the Worthington conspiracy was never officially recorded. But you investigated them. I did. Then you must know their names. Holmes opened a drawer in the desk and withdrew a small leather notebook. It was one I had seen only rarely during our years together. This, he said, placing it on the table, is the only surviving record of that investigation. I leaned forward. You kept your own notes. Holmes nodded. The official documents disappeared when the case was suppressed, but I retained certain observations. He opened the notebook slowly. The pages were filled with Holmes's precise handwriting, names, dates, financial figures, and short analytical remarks written in the compact script he favored when working through complex problems. Holmes turned several pages before stopping. There were 4 principal figures involved, he said. 4 conspirators. Yes, and Major Pemberton was one of them. Holmes pointed to the first name, Arthur Pemberton. He moved his finger downward. The second was Sir Edmund Worthington. I recognized the name immediately. The industrialist. Precisely. Holmes turned another page. The third was Colonel James Rathbone, a military procurement officer responsible for approving certain supply contracts. And the fourth? Holmes paused. For several seconds he did not speak. Holmes? The fourth individual, he said quietly, was a financier named Lionel Ashcroft. I studied the list. If Havelock intends to punish those responsible for the conspiracy, then Pemberton was only the first. Holmes nodded. Yes. 3 others remain. Holmes closed the notebook slowly. And each of them, he said, holds a position of considerable influence. Then Holmes remained silent for several seconds. I waited. At last he spoke again. Watson, he said quietly, "I believe we may have misunderstood the situation." "How so?" I asked. Holmes looked up from the notebook. "The man who wrote those letters," he paused for a moment, "may not be hunting his enemies." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes closed the notebook carefully and rested his hand upon it. "He may be hunting the truth." The words lingered in the room. For a moment I said nothing. Then I spoke slowly. "You mean these murders are not merely acts of revenge?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "That is precisely what I mean." I stood and began pacing the room. "If that is the case," I said, "then the pattern is even more dangerous than we believed." Holmes watched me thoughtfully. "Yes." I looked again at the notebook. "Holmes, if the pattern continues, the next target must be either Worthington, Rathbone, or Ashcroft." Holmes nodded. "Quite so. And if Havelock truly intends to expose the conspiracy as well as punish those responsible." Holmes finished the thought for me. "Then the murders will serve a second purpose, to draw attention." "Yes." Holmes folded his arms. "A public scandal involving men of such prominence would force the buried details of the Worthington affair into the open. And with them," I said slowly, "your own involvement in suppressing the case." Holmes's expression did not change. "That is correct." For several moments, neither of us spoke. The weight of that realization hung heavily in the room. "If that is his objective," I said at last, "then this will not end with one or two murders." Holmes shook his head. "No." At that moment, the quiet of Baker Street was interrupted by a sudden sound outside. A carriage stopped abruptly before the house. Footsteps hurried across the pavement. Then came the sharp knock of the front door. Holmes's eyes moved instantly toward the stairway. A moment later, hurried steps echoed up the staircase. The door burst open. Inspector Gregson entered once more, his expression more grim than before. Holmes did not appear surprised. "Another death?" he asked quietly. Gregson removed his hat slowly. "Yes." "Who?" Gregson's voice was heavy. "Sir Edmund Worthington." The name fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. I turned sharply toward Holmes. He had not moved. His gaze had drifted to the small notebook lying open on the table. 2 names on the list were now marked by death. Holmes closed the book gently. "The pattern," he said quietly, "is confirmed." Gregson nodded grimly. "And unless we stop him quickly," Holmes finished the sentence himself, "the remaining debts will soon be collected." Inspector Gregson's announcement seemed to extinguish what little calm remained in our sitting room. For a moment, none of us spoke. Outside, the fading daylight had begun to surrender to evening, and the gas lamps along Baker Street flickered into life one by one, casting pale halos of light through the gathering fog. Holmes remained standing beside the table. His eyes rested on the small leather notebook in which the names of the conspirators had been recorded. For several seconds he regarded the page in silence before closing the book carefully. 2 names had now been claimed by death. Arthur Pemberton, Sir Edmund Worthington. Gregson broke the silence. "The circumstances are almost identical to the first murder," he said. Holmes looked up. "Explain." Gregson removed his notebook and began speaking with the measured tone of a man recounting disturbing facts. Worthington was found in his private office at his residence in Kensington. The room was locked from the inside. Holmes nodded slightly. "And the cause of death? Unknown? No visible injuries?" "None." Holmes folded his arms. "And the message?" Gregson produced another folded sheet of paper. Holmes took it. He opened it slowly. The words written on the page were identical in style to those we had seen before. The second payment of the old debt. Beneath the message appeared the same solitary letter. Holmes stared at the page for several seconds before placing it carefully on the table. "The pattern continues," he said quietly. Gregson looked impatient. "Holmes, if you know anything about the man responsible for this, now is the time to say it." Holmes turned toward him. "I believe the man responsible is Colonel Adrian Havelock." Gregson frowned. "The same individual you mentioned earlier?" "Yes." "And you say he was involved in the Worthington affair?" Holmes nodded. "He was the officer who attempted to expose the conspiracy." Gregson rubbed his chin thoughtfully. And after the investigation was halted, he disappeared. Precisely. Gregson's brow furrowed, yet you believed him dead. I had every reason to. Gregson looked again at the message on the table. Well, it appears your ghost has returned. Holmes did not reply. Instead, he moved slowly toward the window and gazed out into the foggy street below. After a moment, he spoke. There is something about these murders that requires careful consideration. Gregson sighed. I should hope so. Holmes ignored the remark. Colonel Havelock was not an ordinary man, he continued. During the original investigation, I had ample opportunity to study his character. What sort of man was he? I asked. Holmes remained looking out the window. Highly intelligent, he said quietly. Disciplined, patient. He turned back toward us. And most importantly, methodical. Gregson folded his arms, which makes him a particularly dangerous killer. Yes. Holmes walked slowly back toward the table. But there is something else. What? Gregson asked. Holmes placed his finger on the message. These killings are not acts of impulsive revenge. Gregson frowned. They look very much like revenge to me. Holmes shook his head. No. Why not? Because revenge driven by anger rarely unfolds with such precision. Holmes opened the leather notebook again. The names of the remaining conspirators stared up from the page. Colonel James Rathbone, Lionel Ashcroft. Holmes tapped the book lightly. Havelock is not merely punishing these men. Then what is he doing? Gregson demanded. Holmes looked at him calmly. He is conducting an operation. Gregson blinked. An operation? Yes. Holmes turned the notebook so that both of us could see the list of names clearly. Observe the sequence. Gregson leaned forward reluctantly. Pemberton was the intermediary who facilitated the financial arrangements. Yes. Worthington was the primary architect of the conspiracy. Yes. Holmes turned another page where additional notes appeared. The next logical target would be Colonel Rathbone. Gregson looked uneasy. The procurement officer. Precisely. Gregson paced the room once. You make it sound as though he is following a strategic plan. Holmes nodded. He is. Gregson stopped. Why? Holmes closed the notebook again, because Havelock is not merely settling a personal score. He looked once more at the message on the table. He is constructing a narrative. Gregson frowned. A narrative? Yes. Holmes's voice had taken on the calm tone he used when explaining a complex deduction. Each murder exposes one element of the conspiracy. Pemberton revealed the financial intermediaries. Worthington revealed the industrial beneficiaries. Gregson's expression slowly changed. And Rathbone would expose the military authorization behind the scheme. Gregson stared at him. You mean Havelock intends to reveal the entire scandal step by step? Holmes nodded. Yes. And the final name on the list? I asked. Holmes's gaze moved to the notebook again. Lionel Ashcroft. The financier. Yes. Gregson rubbed his temples. This could become a national scandal. Holmes said nothing. But if Havelock exposes all four conspirators, Gregson continued, the entire Worthington affair will be dragged into the open. Holmes met my eyes briefly. And with it, I said quietly, the circumstances that forced you to abandon the investigation. Holmes inclined his head slightly. That is correct. Gregson looked from one of us to the other. So the killer is not only punishing these men, Holmes finished the thought. He is destroying the reputation of everyone connected with the case. Gregson stared at Holmes. Which includes you? Holmes gave a faint smile. Yes. For a moment the room was silent again. Then Gregson spoke. Well, he said, if Colonel Havelock is responsible for these murders, we must find him before he reaches Rathbone. Holmes shook his head slightly. Gregson frowned. What now? Holmes stepped closer to the window again. The difficulty, Inspector, is that Havelock has always preferred to remain unseen. Gregson snorted. Well, he cannot remain invisible forever. Holmes looked down at the fog-covered street below. No, he said quietly, but he does not need to. Gregson folded his arms. What do you mean? Holmes turned back toward us. "If my understanding of his strategy is correct," he said calmly, "then Colonel Havelock has no intention of hiding." Gregson looked puzzled. "Why not?" Holmes's eyes moved once more to the list of names in the notebook. "Because the man we seek," he said quietly, "has already placed himself somewhere far closer to us than we realize." Gregson stiffened. "You think he is watching us?" Holmes nodded slightly. "Yes. And if that is true," Holmes closed the notebook slowly, "then Colonel Adrian Havelock is not merely orchestrating these murders from the shadows." He looked toward the door of our sitting room. "He is waiting for us to make the next move." The revelation that Colonel Adrian Havelock might already be watching us cast a long and unsettling shadow over Baker Street that evening. Inspector Gregson remained standing near the fireplace, his arms folded and his brow furrowed in troubled concentration. The fog outside had grown thicker again, pressing against the windows like a silent observer. For several moments no one spoke. Then Gregson broke the silence. "Holmes," he said, "if this man is following the pattern you described, then the next victim must be Colonel James Rathbone." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "That is the most logical conclusion." Gregson paced the room once. "And if we know the next target, surely we can prevent the murder." Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved slowly to the table and opened the leather notebook once more. "Rathbone," he murmured. His finger traced the line of text beside the name. "Former colonel in the procurement division of the War Office. Retired 8 years ago." Gregson leaned forward. "Where does he live?" Holmes scanned the page briefly. "Cadogan Square." Gregson straightened. "Then we must warn him at once." Holmes looked up. "Yes." The answer came so calmly that Gregson blinked in surprise. "You agree?" "Of course." Gregson seized his hat immediately. "Then we shall go there now." Holmes raised one hand gently. "One moment, Inspector." Gregson frowned. "What now?" Holmes closed the notebook. "If Colonel Havelock intends to strike Rathbone next, we must consider how he will do it." Gregson shrugged impatiently. "However he did the previous 2 murders." Holmes shook his head slightly. "That would be unlikely." "Why?" Holmes walked slowly toward the window again. "Because repeating the same method twice invites detection." Gregson looked skeptical. "He has already repeated it once." "Yes," Holmes said, "but repetition is rarely the habit of a man who prides himself on strategic thinking." Gregson sighed. "Holmes, we cannot solve the entire mystery while Rathbone sits alone waiting to be killed." Holmes turned. "You misunderstand me, Inspector." Gregson frowned. "I do?" "Yes." Holmes stepped toward the table again. "I have no intention of allowing Colonel Rathbone to remain unprotected." Gregson's impatience softened slightly. "Good." Holmes folded the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. "But warning him will not be sufficient." Gregson raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because Havelock expects it." Gregson blinked. "Expects it?" "Yes." Holmes spoke calmly. "The moment news of Worthington's death becomes public, anyone connected to the old conspiracy will begin fearing for his life." "That seems reasonable." "Indeed." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "And Colonel Havelock knows this perfectly well." Gregson considered the point. "You think he planned for that reaction?" "Certainly." Holmes began pacing slowly across the room. "If Rathbone receives police protection tonight, Havelock will simply wait." Gregson rubbed his chin. "Wait, for what?" "For fear to do his work for him." Gregson frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes stopped near the mantelpiece. "Fear produces mistakes." Gregson's eyes narrowed. "You believe Rathbone might try to flee?" "Possibly. Or hide. Also possible." Gregson nodded slowly, and either action could make him vulnerable. Holmes gave a faint smile. "Exactly." Gregson stared at Holmes for a moment. "Well then," he said, "what do you propose?" Holmes looked thoughtful. "First," he said, "we must ensure that Rathbone remains exactly where he is." Gregson nodded. "That should not be difficult." "Second," Holmes continued, "we must observe the house carefully." Gregson leaned forward. "You think Havelock will come tonight?" Holmes shook his head slightly. "I do not know." "Then why the urgency?" Holmes's expression grew serious. Because Colonel Adrian Havelock is not merely killing men. Gregson frowned again. We have established that. Holmes gestured toward the 2 messages lying on the table. He is sending messages. Gregson glanced at the papers. Yes, and every message is intended for a particular audience. Who? Holmes met Gregson's gaze. Me. Gregson hesitated. You believe he is provoking you? Yes. And if that is true, Holmes's voice grew quieter. Then he will expect me to interfere before Rathbone becomes the next victim. Gregson nodded slowly. So he will prepare for that. Holmes smiled faintly. Undoubtedly. Gregson picked up his hat again. Well, he said, if this Havelock fellow wishes to challenge Sherlock Holmes, he has chosen an unfortunate opponent. Holmes's smile faded slightly. Do not underestimate him, Inspector. Gregson paused. You still respect him. Holmes did not deny it. Colonel Havelock, he said quietly, is one of the few men I have ever encountered whose mind operates with comparable discipline to my own. Gregson stared at him. That is high praise. Yes, and if he truly intends to complete his revenge. Holmes turned toward the door. Then tonight may prove decisive. Gregson nodded firmly. Very well. He moved toward the door. Cadogan Square. Holmes reached for his coat. Yes. As we prepared to leave Baker Street, Holmes paused briefly beside the table and looked once more at the 2 messages left by the murderer. The first payment, the second payment, Holmes folded them carefully and slipped them into his pocket. Then he spoke quietly. Let us hope, he said, that we arrive before the 3rd payment becomes due. Our arrival at Cadogan Square revealed a neighborhood already unsettled by rumor. The fog that had clung stubbornly to London all day had begun to thin by evening, yet the air retained a damp chill that seemed to sharpen every sound along the quiet street. Gas lamps burned steadily beside the pavements, illuminating rows of elegant townhouses whose darkened windows suggested anxious occupants watching events unfold from behind drawn curtains. Inspector Gregson directed the cab to stop before a tall residence near the center of the square. That is Colonel Rathbone's house, he said, pointing toward a stately building with a narrow iron gate leading to the entrance. 2 constables were already stationed outside. Gregson stepped from the cab and approached them. Any sign of trouble? He asked. None, sir, one of the men replied. Holmes had remained silent during the journey. But as we walked toward the gate, he paused briefly, studying the building with the same intense scrutiny he had applied to the study in Belgrave Square earlier that morning. Have the police already spoken with Colonel Rathbone? Holmes asked. Gregson nodded. Yes, I sent a man ahead. And how did the colonel respond to the news of Worthington's death? Gregson gave a short shrug. He seemed shaken naturally, but he insisted there was no reason to believe he was in danger. Holmes's expression darkened slightly. That response does not surprise me. Gregson frowned. Why not? Holmes walked slowly up the path toward the front door. Because men who have spent their lives in positions of authority rarely imagine themselves as victims. Gregson knocked firmly. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a middle-aged servant whose nervous expression betrayed the tension within the house. Inspector Gregson, the man said quickly. The colonel is expecting you. We were led into a large drawing room where Colonel James Rathbone stood beside the fireplace. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with the rigid posture of a career soldier. His hair had begun to gray at the temples, yet his expression remained stern and controlled. Inspector, he said, stepping forward. Gregson introduced Holmes and me. Rathbone's gaze lingered briefly on Holmes. So this is the famous consulting detective, he said. Holmes inclined his head politely. I regret that the circumstances of our meeting are less than pleasant. Rathbone gave a short nod. I understand you believe someone intends to harm me. Gregson spoke first. 2 men connected to the Worthington affair have already been murdered. Rathbone's jaw tightened slightly. I heard, and the messages left at both scenes suggest a pattern. Rathbone glanced toward Holmes again. Then you believe I am the next target. Holmes studied him carefully. It is a possibility. Rathbone turned away and walked toward the window. I see. His tone remained calm, yet there was a tension beneath it that even he seemed unable to conceal. Colonel, Gregson continued, we strongly advise that you remain in the house tonight under police protection. Rathbone folded his arms. And the man responsible for these murders? Holmes answered quietly. Colonel Adrian Havelock. Rathbone's reaction was immediate. He turned sharply. Havelock? Holmes watched him closely. You know the name? Rathbone gave a bitter laugh. Know it? Of course I know it. He walked back toward the fireplace. That man nearly destroyed several respectable careers 20 years ago. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. You speak as though his accusations were false. Rathbone hesitated. They were exaggerated. Holmes did not reply. The silence stretched uncomfortably for a moment before Rathbone spoke again. And now you claim he has returned to London seeking revenge. That is our belief, Gregson said. Rathbone shook his head. Nonsense, Holmes spoke quietly. 2 men are already dead. Rathbone's expression hardened. If Havelock truly intended to kill me, he said he would have done so long ago. Holmes studied him for several seconds. Perhaps. Rathbone turned toward him. Mr. Holmes, I served this country for 30 years. I do not intend to hide behind police officers because of some grudge carried by a disgruntled former officer. Gregson opened his mouth to argue, but Holmes raised a hand gently. Colonel Rathbone, Holmes said calmly, your courage is admirable, but courage alone will not stop a determined man. Rathbone gave a dismissive wave. I will take my chances. Holmes regarded him silently. At last he spoke again. You knew Adrian Havelock well during the investigation. Rathbone's expression stiffened. Well enough. And you know what happened when the Worthington affair was suppressed? Rathbone did not answer immediately. Holmes continued quietly. The evidence disappeared. Yes, the accusations were buried. Yes. Holmes's voice softened slightly, and the man who risked everything to expose the conspiracy was left with nothing. Rathbone looked away. That was not my decision. No, Holmes said. It was mine. Both Gregson and Rathbone turned toward him. Holmes stood perfectly still. 20 years ago, he said quietly, I allowed the Worthington affair to be closed. Rathbone frowned. What do you mean? Holmes met his gaze calmly. I had gathered enough evidence to bring every man involved before a court. Rathbone's expression darkened. But you did not. No. Gregson stared at Holmes. Why? Holmes answered without hesitation. Because I was ordered to abandon the investigation. The room fell silent. Holmes's voice remained steady. At the time I believed that decision necessary. Rathbone looked uneasy. Necessary? Yes. Holmes's gaze drifted briefly toward the window, but in doing so he continued quietly, I allowed the truth to remain buried. Gregson spoke slowly. And Havelock never forgave you? Holmes nodded. No. Rathbone stared at him. You mean to say that these murders? Holmes finished the thought calmly. May be the consequence of a decision I made 20 years ago. The words seemed to settle heavily in the room. For a moment Rathbone said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. If that is true, Mr. Holmes? He paused. Then the man who seeks revenge may not be entirely wrong. Holmes did not respond, but in the silence that followed, I saw something rare in my friend's expression. Not fear, not uncertainty, but the quiet weight of a mistake he had carried for 2 decades and which had now returned to demand its price. The silence that followed Colonel Rathbone's last remark lingered in the drawing room like a weight none of us could easily lift. Outside, the evening had settled fully over Cadogan Square. The gas lamps burned steadily along the quiet street, and the faint glow of their light filtered through the tall windows of the house. Holmes stood near the center of the room, his expression calm once more, though I could see that his thoughts were moving rapidly beneath the composed surface he presented to the world. Inspector Gregson cleared his throat. Well, he said, whether Havelock believes himself justified or not, 2 men are already dead. He turned toward Rathbone. And I have no intention of allowing a third. Rathbone said nothing. His earlier confidence had diminished somewhat, replaced by a thoughtful tension that suggested Holmes's admission had unsettled him more deeply than he wished to show. Gregson continued, "I shall leave 2 officers stationed at the house tonight." Rathbone gave a short nod. "Very well." Holmes spoke quietly. "Inspector, may I examine the house?" Gregson looked surprised. "Of course." Holmes turned toward Rathbone. "If Colonel Havelock intends to reach you here, he will almost certainly have studied the building in advance." Rathbone frowned slightly. "You believe he might attempt to enter the house?" "It is possible." Holmes moved toward the door. "I should like to see the study where you spend your evenings." Rathbone hesitated only briefly before leading us down the hallway to a smaller room at the rear of the house. "This is where I usually work," he said. The room was plainly furnished but comfortable. A desk stood near the window overlooking a small garden, and several shelves of books lined the walls. Holmes began his examination immediately. He moved slowly around the room, studying the windows, the walls, and the arrangement of furniture with the quiet intensity I had witnessed many times before. Gregson watched him with growing impatience. "You think Havelock might already be inside the house?" he said. Holmes did not answer. Instead, he knelt beside the desk and examined the carpet carefully. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes rose again. Nothing conclusive. He crossed the room and opened the window slightly. The cool evening air drifted inside. After a moment, he closed the window again and turned toward Rathbone. "You keep this room locked at night?" "Yes." "And the windows?" "Also secured." Holmes nodded slowly. "Very good." Gregson frowned. "That was the same arrangement in the previous 2 murders." "Yes." Holmes turned away thoughtfully. "Which suggests that Colonel Havelock has a preference for theatrical symmetry." Gregson sighed. "I care less about his sense of drama than about stopping him." Holmes was about to reply when a sudden knock sounded at the front door of the house. The sound echoed faintly through the hallway. Gregson stiffened. "Who could that be?" Rathbone looked toward the door. "I was not expecting visitors." Gregson moved quickly into the hallway. "Stay here," he said. "We heard voices near the entrance of the house." Moments later, one of the constables appeared in the doorway of the study. "Inspector," he said. Gregson stepped forward. "What is it?" "A messenger arrived just now." "From whom?" "He did not say, sir. He left this." The constable handed Gregson a sealed envelope. Holmes had already crossed the room. "May I?" he asked. Gregson handed it to him. Holmes examined the envelope carefully. "There is no sender's name," he said quietly. He broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Holmes unfolded it. For several seconds he read the message in silence. Then he handed it to Gregson. Gregson's eyes widened as he read the words. "Good heavens." "What does it say?" Rathbone demanded. Gregson looked at Holmes before answering. "It says," he read aloud slowly, "Mr. Holmes, you have done precisely what I expected. You have warned Colonel Rathbone. You have placed the police around him. You have attempted to correct the mistake you made 20 years ago." Gregson stopped. Holmes gestured calmly. "Continue." Gregson read the final lines. "But you are still too late. The 3rd payment has already been arranged. You will soon understand the cost of the decision you made in the Worthington affair. H." The room fell silent. Rathbone's face had grown pale. "What does he mean?" he asked. Holmes took the letter back and read it once more. "He means exactly what he says." Gregson frowned. "But Rathbone is alive." Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes," Gregson pointed to the message. "Then what does he mean by the 3rd payment?" Holmes folded the letter carefully. "I believe Colonel Havelock intends us to discover that answer ourselves." Rathbone looked uneasy. "And when will that be?" Holmes placed the letter on the desk. "Very soon." Gregson's voice sharpened. "What makes you say that?" Holmes glanced briefly toward the window. "Because Havelock has always preferred dramatic timing." Gregson stared at him. "You think he is nearby?" Holmes's expression remained thoughtful. "Yes." Rathbone stepped forward anxiously. "Then we must search the house immediately." Holmes shook his head. "That will not help." Gregson looked frustrated. "Why not?" Holmes's voice grew quiet, because the message does not suggest that the third victim is here. Gregson blinked. Then where? Holmes met his gaze calmly. If I'm correct, he said, Colonel Adrian Havelock has just set the final stage of his plan. Gregson frowned. What plan? Holmes folded the letter again. A plan designed to reveal the truth behind the Worthington affair. Rathbone's voice trembled slightly. And the third payment? Holmes's expression darkened. I fear, he said quietly, that we are about to learn that the debt Havelock intends to collect extends far beyond the men who once betrayed him. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You have returned to London to complete your revenge, Colonel Havelock. For a moment, the figure standing in the shadows said nothing. Then Havelock gave a slow, almost weary shake of his head. No, Holmes, I did not return to London to kill them. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Then why return after 20 years? Havelock met his gaze steadily. I returned to force you to reveal the truth you buried. For several seconds after Holmes spoke, the room remained completely still. Inspector Gregson stared at the folded letter on the desk as though willing it to reveal some further explanation. Colonel Rathbone, who had maintained an appearance of rigid control throughout the evening, now looked visibly unsettled. Outside, the quiet of Cadogan Square seemed to deepen. Then Holmes moved. He picked up the letter again and studied it once more, his sharp eyes tracing each word with deliberate care. Holmes, Gregson said impatiently, if Havelock has already arranged the third murder, we cannot simply stand here. Holmes did not look up. No. Then where do we go? Holmes folded the letter slowly. Back to Baker Street. Gregson blinked. Baker Street? Yes, that makes no sense, Gregson protested. The next target is Rathbone. Holmes shook his head. No, Inspector, Gregson frowned. You said the pattern suggested Rathbone would be next. I did. Then why leave him here? Holmes turned toward Rathbone. Because Colonel Rathbone is no longer the primary objective. Rathbone stiffened. What do you mean? Holmes's voice was calm. The earlier murders were intended to draw attention. Gregson stared at him. To draw attention? Yes. Holmes stepped closer to the desk. Pemberton exposed the financial intermediary. Worthington exposed the industrial mastermind. Gregson nodded impatiently. Yes, Holmes met his gaze. But the final act of Havelock's plan does not concern Colonel Rathbone. Gregson hesitated. Then who? Holmes spoke quietly. Me. Holmes extended the folder toward Gregson. These documents will ensure that the full story is revealed. Gregson accepted them slowly. And the secret that was meant to destroy you? He asked Holmes quietly. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. My reputation, Inspector, he said, is of little value if it rests upon a concealed injustice. Havelock regarded him thoughtfully. Then perhaps, he said slowly, Sherlock Holmes has not changed as much as I feared. Holmes turned toward the window where the fog still drifted across Baker Street. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. No, he said. I have merely learned that truth, once buried, has a habit of returning. The room fell silent once more. Outside, the fog rolled slowly along Baker Street, drifting past the dim glow of the gas lamps like a ghost wandering through the night. Holmes remained standing by the window, his tall figure half lost in the shadows. For a long moment he watched the quiet street below. Then he spoke again, almost as though the thought had come to him only then. Remember this, Watson, he said quietly. I looked up from my chair. No secret truly belongs to the past. He paused. It merely waits. Holmes's eyes followed the slow movement of the fog beyond the glass, for the right moment to be discovered. And with that final observation, the long shadow of the Worthington affair, which had followed Sherlock Holmes for 20 years, at last began to fade into the misty streets of London.